So the first question I have is directed to you, Yone, and so I was wondering, you know, Extinction Rebellion is not particularly well known in Iceland, or at least compared to some other climate activist organizations. So how did you first kind of come across Extinction Rebellion, and where did the idea really for this film come?
Well, I'm a very well-informed person, so I follow the news. No, but seriously, I've always been interested in the environment, and I noticed when XR was formed, and I followed it for about a year, and I saw that it really wasn't getting a lot of media attention. So I thought maybe there is a way to tell their story, because nobody else seemed to be telling a story. I worked around, I talked around, and nobody was interested, so I just thought, well, it's something I'm personally very interested in, so the best way that I can do something is to do what I know, which is to make a film.
Fantastic. And talking about telling a story, so you know, you seem to have gone for quite a different direction in terms of filmmaking style to your classic Hollywood documentary film, and you seem to be relying a lot on, for example, archive footage. And I'd be really interested to hear a little bit more about the approach that you went to this one.
Well, that's a long story, because along the way, particularly when COVID hit, we were thinking maybe we don't have a movie. But at the same time, I've always been interested in the way film is evolving with all the new technology we have. A lot of stuff we shot on iPhone, and we did Zoom interviews, and I thought, you know, particularly being from Iceland, being from Europe, where we have much less resources and money to make films, the technology can actually really help us. So we decided, let's not the limitations limit us. Let's use the limitations to work for us. So it's actually became a part of a little bit of a personal journey for me in terms of proving, at least to myself, that films can be made in a different way. We don't need 10 trucks around every interview.
And what's interesting as well about the film, at least, is obviously it was made during COVID, but you know, whereas most kind of filmmaking approaches and styles, right, would have been severely debilitated by the kind of ongoing pandemic and inability to travel and all this kind of stuff. You know, the approach that you've adopted is kind of much more friendly, you know, weirdly enough, towards this kind of event. So could you maybe talk a little bit maybe then about how kind of COVID influenced the project and what that was like?
Well, we just decided not to travel. We decided to reach out to all these groups. So it was, by the way, quite complex, because there was a world lockdown for a while. And, but we managed to, and we managed to get them to speak to us, and we kind of built this kind of connection without any travel, without shooting a lot of the protests ourselves. We shot some in the US, and then rely on people like Sam and the heads, even though there are supposed to be no heads of XR, to provide us with footage. And we actually ended up getting a lot of footage from various XR groups and XR activists around the world that have put it into let's say, a free zone, so to speak, accessible for everyone to use if they want to. You can see the quality of the imagery varies a lot, but we decided to, let's try to make that work for us. So some of the stuff we took from TV, instead of trying to take the lines out, we enhanced the lines. Let's make it a part of the reality we have. And this is the first time I see it work this way, so I'll comment on that later.
And then maybe now a question for you, Sam. So I've been told that you've kind of, also it appears in the title credits that you've kind of recently stepped away from Extinction Rebellion. I'd be interested to hear your kind of decision as to why and kind of what motivated that, and yeah, even maybe what you're up to now.
Sure. Well, I think basically what you saw there really perfectly captured both the successes and failures of Extinction Rebellion, because basically the story of XR hitherto, right, is a story of a success which defined a moment, and then it was the story of how a social movement copes with success. And the success we had was a kind of notional success. It was a bit of lip service, really. It was, look, we're going to stand up and say that this is an emergency. We might not do anything about it, but we're very happy to give in to your first demand of declaring an emergency. And what happened after that period, and we were very lucky to get to that period, and we were good to get to that period. We did some things right as well. What happened after that was a process of fragmentation in the movement. I'm really interested in the moment about how to turbocharge the life cycle of social movements, how to keep them being radical, how to keep them being coherent. One of the problems that we then faced was that many of us believed that the movement should go in various different directions, and you saw people touching upon it there. There were those of us, mainly from the kind of younger generation, but what we might call the kind of climate justice movement, saying, look, those three demands that we initially had, which was to tell the truth, net zero by 2025, sit-ins assemblies, were all kind of notional demands. They were one step on the way to something bigger, and we now need to talk about structural problems. We need to talk about capitalism, we need to talk about colonialism, we need to talk about how system change actually happens. And so those of us in the movement that were arguing that what we need now is the next three set of transitional demands. And they don't have to be anything that's going to totally blow people's minds. Maybe that's nationalising energy companies, reparations, loss and damage payments, right? But it's another step on the way to systemic, real, radical change. Unfortunately, we lost the debate within the movement. And the people arguing against us, people like Roger, who don't believe in climate justice, also lost the argument. To a kind of fair analysis of what happened is basically that we created a social movement which was decentralized, and that was fantastic for mobilizing people at pace over a short amount of time, but it also meant that it wasn't intrinsically a democratic movement. So when you're faced then with a big question, a big strategic question of what happens next, and we see these all the time at the moment, because crisis upon crisis means that we have to affect and change our strategy. When we're faced with those big questions, Extinction Rebellion just wasn't able to shift. And so those of us, on actually both sides of that argument, so Roger's gone off and he's now encouraging young people to set themselves on fire, and there are those of us that have also left and are trying to work with unions and are trying to build genuinely radical campaigns for change. Obviously that's my own spin on things, but I guess what I'm saying is that the movement continues in the UK in its kind of moribund fashion, it's kind of sticking to its old principles, and everybody around the edges of that has decided to kind of splinter. What was really interesting about this film is seeing all the global stuff that's happening, because obviously I'm so sort of in the weeds of XR UK, and you can forget about all the amazing work that moment kind of triggered around the world.
Yeah, at least, so I guess a certain irony about the situation, kind of XR's inability to change in the last couple of years. So at least I heard this from Ian, who's one of the Shell 7, and he's a Quaker, and according to him, Extinction Rebellion was actually supposed to be a temporary movement. At the time when Roger Hallam kind of came up with XR, he'd just been cycling through all sorts of different things, and then XR is just kind of the one that ended up becoming big. So just to kind of add to that point. But then so I guess kind of building on that kind of line of thought, right? Where if you look at Extinction Rebellion in kind of more kind of historic terms in terms of activism, right? The kind of thing that it's really drawing on and kind of gets this idea of occupation from, including the name, Occupy Wall Street, and to a certain extent, at least least how I understand it, XR saw itself as kind of taking a certain kind of model from Occupy Wall Street and then kind of building on it and learning from the lessons about what didn't work then, right? And essentially, again, as far as I understand, you might comment differently, but that's where kind of the idea of like self-organizing systems comes from, is to kind of repair those mistakes. Because so to the crowd maybe less familiar, Occupy Wall Street happened in 2011, I believe, and then went on, for a few years. But there was kind of an essential moment where protesters gathered and basically occupied this enormous park in the middle of New York for quite some time. But so my question to you would be, the next movement. What is the lessons that we've learned from the same way that we maybe learned from Occupy Wall Street?
That's a really super interesting question, and not a lot of people. I end up doing a lot of these kind of things at the moment. Of like, how did Extinction Rebellion go wrong, and what can we do next? And that's one of the first times that people's mentioned Occupy to me, and it's a really important thing to think about in the context of Extinction Rebellion, because a lot of the people that organised for Occupy ended up crashing and burning out of Occupy, and then eventually coming back and coming into Extinction Rebellion. I've got lots of thoughts around that, which I won't bore you with. One of the more frustrating things for me, as somebody that wanted to critique the economic system that we were working in, was that I was surrounded by people who genuinely did understand the problems of capitalism. Like, a lot of them had been radicalised by the Occupy movement, and yet were almost self-censoring. Their attitude was, climate change is not something that we are going to use those kind of tactics about. And so I actually think there's a conversation about what we didn't learn from Occupy as well as what we did learn, right? But you're absolutely right. Extinction Rebellion was meant to be a kind of temporary thing. And again, when a lot of us kind of realised that something else needed to come along, there was a big discussion about whether we should pack it up as well. So some of us were in favour in like 2020 of going, maybe we kind of achieved what we set out to achieve, right? And not only did it unleash lots of stuff around the world, like in the UK, it's also trained and radicalised a whole new generation of activists, right? So there's people like me that probably, wouldn't have done the sort of stuff that I'm doing now if it wasn't for Extinction Rebellion, and loads of campaigns that have come from that are doing brilliant stuff. And there were those of us that are basically like, we're now just taking up space, kind of pointlessly. What happens next? But in order to answer that question, you need to sort of have two coherent answers. And one of those is about ideology, and the other one is about strategy. That's like much longer answers that we can all talk about over a glass of wine or whatever. But like fundamentally, I think these are the two things. The next movement that comes along, and I think there will be another movement that comes along, needs to centre climate justice in its approach. The fight now is not whether climate change exists or not. We've won that, right? And we all need to get out of that headspace. And for a long time, we've been labouring under old fights. The climate movement has been stuck in like a pre-2019 world. But 2019, in terms of climate activism in the Western world, changed everything, right? The way that people's attitude to climate shifted. Even capitalists are engaging very seriously and credibly, some of them, with what to do about climate change, right? So in order to have any kind of sway in this debate, whether you're approaching it from a kind of social democratic paradigm or a genuinely revolutionary one, you need to have an answer to that ideological problem of like, what is your vision for the future? What is it that you're actually fighting for? And some people genuinely don't have an answer to that, and I think we do have one, and it is one of progressive politics. But the next thing that we need to talk about is strategy. That's a much harder thing to talk about like really shortly, but one of the things that we need to be really aware of and resist is just the politics of spectacle. We can't allow protest just to become some piece of theatricality, sort of performed for the elite so that occasionally they doff their hat to you and give you a concession, right? We need to mobilize people in genuinely radical movements that aim to transform the apparatus of the state. And how we do that in such a short time frame is the biggest question of our age.
reasons that I was interested in XR was how they used, obviously the idea of leaderless movement is a tricky one. And everybody knows the revolution eats its own children. But I thought a lot of the ideas and concepts that ignited XR are very valid for any kind of future protests. And that's why the music, the Red Rebels, because I think that's adding to what we know as normal protests. So even as the groups evolve, change, some die out and something else will come instead, I think some of those tactics that were highlighted by the formation and by the beginning of XR and then in other countries where it was applicable really helped draw attention and focus on the global warming problem.
Thank you. Yeah, I would also say, what's just so interesting about all of this is when one is engaged in activism, and in general trying to deal with a problem like climate change, it's a constantly evolving problem, it's a constantly evolving game. And yeah, we see, with kind of the change in police tactics to how they've responded to non-violent, or XR's non-violent civil disobedience, right? And the taking of the bridges, as your documentary shows incredibly well, they're just dragging protesters off. This creates for the best photo opportunity ever if you're an activist. Your dream is to be dragged away by a policeman and preferably get a little bit of a bloody nose or something like that in the process. And then, now in recent years, they've entirely stopped doing that. They just form circles around the places that XR people are protesting, and they don't let new people in, and that makes for an absolutely terrible photo op. So that doesn't get very far. I thought now might be a time to maybe open the room to the audience, and if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. Yes. Do we have a second mic, or should I just?
I think you can hear me. My name is Anna. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sam. It's encouraging to hear that you kind of are to hear about the strategies that you are, or the strategizing that you are thinking of now and getting yourself involved in. I was in Britain as well. I lived in Britain at this time, and this movie is very revealing to how much impact it had for the rest of the world, because I think we were all in Britain just very sort of almost like London centric at the time, and seeing the bridges, and I very well remember the kind of change of atmosphere and opinion when the public transport was taken over and how the public wasn't sort of agreeing with it, because it took away the hope that we could do something different than being in cars and kind of polluting and all that. But I was just wondering, I'm curious to see what's the distribution strategy for this film, because I think it's so important that people see it, and I think it's very urgent that people see it, because it's such a document of what's happening now and makes us think what is happening next and how do we have to adapt ourselves.
Well, there is no strategy. It depends on, you let the film speak for itself. But having been a distributor also for many years, even though also as a producer on the other side, I think you let the film see if it gets a little bit wind in the sails. But I think films like these days, and film festivals for that matter, slightly changed the world after COVID, but they need support. And so in America, this is called forewalling. So I don't know if there's a term really in Europe for the same thing in distribution, which is instead of putting the film in theaters in many places at the same time, you take the film and you travel with it, with people that are involved with either the film or the movement, or interested in social activism or in the environmental crisis. And that's how film gains support, and that's how you get the message, if I can say so. Whatever people want to take away from the film, that's how you get that out. And it's actually something, you know, this is the first screening. I have some ideas, we'll see what happens. It will eventually go on television here and there, but I think there is enough interest in getting people to see the film if it's presented in the correct way. And that's something we figure along as we go along. I just want to finish also, sorry, I just thought, because this is a film, because like I was saying, during the making of the film, I just started kind of putting some of my own thoughts about filmmaking in the future into practice. And so it was self-financed, so you don't need necessarily a lot of money these days to make a film. If you have a subject you're passionate about, or something that possibly people could be interested in, or is of interest. And I think the same thing is going to happen in film distribution. And so I think it's a way for me, again, as a producer for many, many years, decades, to change the way we also distribute and bring films to people in the theater.
Next question.
Yeah, hi. In a lot of different grassroots organizations, environmental ones particularly, such as Greenpeace, if you look at their financial reports, they haven't been as honest, and maybe that's because they've been around longer and they've been able to almost get greedy, while XR is around for such a short amount of time and such a big impact, and kind of everyone's gone their own directions. Obviously, I don't know your financial reports, but how are you able to keep honest?
Great. For XR?
Yeah, I mean, so Greenpeace is completely bureaucratized now. It sort of started off as a grassroots movement and has become a much more sort of codified NGO. And a lot of people in the British climate movement have like daddy issues about Greenpeace. They're like really like angry at this, which is fair enough because it is really frustrating that a lot of the kind of organisational heft has gone to those kind of like 5 big NGOs, which basically are just sitting on cash, right? There was a report out recently that showed, in terms of like if you want social change, and even if you're just looking for kind of like mild pressure on governments, you're like, in terms of bang for your buck, you're much better donating to grassroots movements than you are to those kind of NGOs. But sort of parking that for a moment, like, again, like it's like longer, in-depth discussions to be had around it. What we're seeing now with the rise of the internet is that, like, when you have the rise of the internet, he says like a 70-year-old man. When you have like a moment where a social movement goes in the public consciousness, suddenly money floods in. And actually, social movements and activists need to start thinking a lot better about how to spend that money, because we kind of decided to give everybody who wanted to in the movement money, right? I mean, but basically what happened is that we said, do you know what, if you're part of this movement, if you're coming into the office, if you're here organising protests, you can claim expenses to go buy a big pink boat or whatever. Which meant that we also, you know, while having very quick, successful actions, also ran out of money really, really quickly and are constantly kind of fundraising. So somewhere in between the two, I think, needs to sort of happen. If you want to have a conversation about this, we can have a conversation about it, because, you know, Black Lives Matter fell into lots of problems with what it was doing with all the money that it mobilised. And it's a really interesting issue, but it's, yeah, not one that I have many answers for.
So I just want to comment on this because it applies to the way I made the film. In 2015, Charles Ferguson, who won the Oscar for his film about the financial crisis called Inside Job, did a film called Time for Change. And it cost 4 million euros. It was 2.5 hours long. It was all about the environment. It was fantastic. It looked amazing. And the first thing, when I was looking at the film, I'm thinking, I don't see a problem here. Everything he's showing us in helicopters and drones looks beautiful. But obviously his film, and this is, you know, extremely experienced and great filmmaker, and he had no impact. I'm not saying that I can have impact, but I realized, okay, he did it the conventional way, and he got nothing out of it. Obviously, he was talking much more general, and he didn't have a specific group that he was dealing with. But I thought, okay, that strategy obviously didn't work. Having a lot of money and showing a lot of beautiful environment, even though some of it is obviously disappearing. So I thought, his strategy doesn't work. So maybe do something completely different, where I can have control, where it's not about trying to raise money and spending my time and energy and efforts to try to get people to support it. Let's just do it the way and hope that the story still comes through. So it's a similar thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting how liberating, in a sense, low-budget filmmaking can be, because it just lets you produce to a certain extent, and make movies and stuff, and not get bogged down. What's also interesting is the fact that both of these things that you guys are talking about, or at least Extinction Rebellion to some extent, and this kind of changing technology. I mean, they're both kind of dependent on changing technologies. I mean, iPhones have totally revolutionized how protesting can happen. The fact that you can be on messaging groups and organize with people that you've never met before in your life, or communicate, across swaths of the country. The fact that you can, so to speak, sit in your room and find information on the internet and videos and do these Zoom calls and everything from Iceland when the content of the film is 1,000 miles away. Quite amazing. Does anybody have any more questions?